In my video about emo rap and the current wave of dark, depressing pop music, I talked about how since the beginning of popular music, the charts have always been dominated by dumb, happy pop songs, even though in retrospect people tend to believe otherwise. Because whenever we talk about the music of the past, we talk about all the amazing, groundbreaking shit that came out back then, but leave out most of the uninspired knockoffs and gimmicky one-hit wonders, cause, most of that shit has a very short shelf life. And naturally, we tend to forget the moments in our life that were not all that significant to us. It's just a way for our brains to free up space, I guess. For example, I remember my first concert experience pretty vividly, but I couldn't tell you what I had for breakfast 10 days ago, because it's not worth remembering. And the same idea applies to the history of music. The problem is that when we filter out all the mediocre crap and only focus on the good stuff, we kind of create an alternate version of the past. A version that never really happened. And when people from my generation or even younger accept this version as 100% factual and don't question it in any way, shape or form, you get sentiments like, ooh, can someone bring real music back? Or, I was born in the wrong generation. Sentiments that annoy the living crap out of me. And sure, some people are just lazy and would rather spend their time complaining than trying to find new music they actually like. But still, I would consider myself a pretty optimistic person when it comes to the future of music. And sometimes I even feel like there was a lot more interesting cutting edge stuff happening back in the 60s, 70s, 80s and 90s. So in this video I want to talk about where this feeling comes from and why I think you shouldn't let nostalgia fool you. Okay, like I said earlier, this whole thing mostly comes down to people filtering out all the crap and only remembering the musical highlights of the past. And if you don't believe me, please, go visit your local record store or thrift shop, skim through the used CD and LP section and tell me what you find. Pat Boone, the Radicals, Bush, some Eurodance, you can still find this stuff everywhere, because it used to be really popular. But nowadays, nobody cares about stuff like this. You know why? Because it's fucking bubblegum. We chew it up, spit it out, and forget it ever existed. It's always been that way. And if you want more factual, statistic proof of that, just look at the Billboard 200 album chart from any given year. Take 1988 for example. What classic albums came out that year that could be on there? NWA Straight Outta Compton, Sonic Youth's Daydream Nation, the Pixies' Serve Rosa, Public Enemy's It Takes a Nation of Millions? Nope. None of those records ever even reached the top 30 on the US album chart. You wanna know what did top the charts in 1988? Fate by George Michael, Hysteria by Def Leppard, the first Tiffany album, and last but not least, the Dirty Dancing soundtrack. And that's the freaking album chart. You don't even wanna know what's on the singles chart. It just goes to show how much your idea of the past differs from what it was actually like back then. But this alternate version of the past is not just a result of people remembering the good stuff and forgetting the bad stuff. What's also a contributing factor is that the history of music is mostly told by people who really care about music. Artists, writers, disc jockeys, filmmakers, music journalists, and those people have a very different relationship with music than, say, your average Tiffany fan. They take music very seriously and often favor artists that have kind of an experimental or at least alternative edge to them because, let's face it, most creative types were fucking weirdos growing up. So the artists and albums that those people champion and recommend to younger music fans are not necessarily a good representation of what popular music was like back then. Because when older people talk about the past, they're mostly pulling from their own personal experiences. And I'm not saying those experiences aren't valid, of course they are. But they shouldn't be taken as historical facts applicable to the entire world of music. Because we've all heard the crazy stories about the hippie movement, the 70s punk scene, the early rave culture, etc. But if you look at the actual numbers, most of the population had nothing to do with those scenes. Because interesting, forward-thinking music has always been something only a small group of people seek out, and usually the mainstream only catches up years later. Otherwise it wouldn't have taken an album like The Velvet Underground and Nico more than a decade to sell some copies, right? Plus, when people compare the music of the past to the music of today, they're often comparing several decades of great music to a few lackluster artists that have been really popular over the last 2 years or so. Like, pop music used to be the Beatles, Bowie, Nirvana and Queen. Now it's just Lil Pump, Ed Sheeran and Daddy Yankee. Like, dudes, that's not a fair comparison. You could do the same thing the other way around and say that pop music used to be Rick Dees, Eiffel 65 and Milli Vanilli. While nowadays we have Frank Ocean, Kendrick Lamar, King Gizzard and Denzel Curry. It's just fucking stupid and it doesn't prove anything. Because every year most of the music that comes out is totally awful. And I'm not even talking so bad it's good or at least kind of funny awful. No, just boring mediocre pep that is not even worth listening to. But in the sea of mediocrity, there's still a lot of great stuff floating around. And as a music fan, it's up to you to find it. A lot of the hidden gems of the past have already been discovered by people from previous generations. But don't let their nostalgia fool you. There is no golden age of music. They're just getting old. Maybe one of the greatest albums of all time came out this week and nobody noticed. I'll hit you up when I find it though.
I keep my address